Okay, continuing on into the colonial era, one thing I want to go back to is the Treaty of Tordesillas that we talked about in terms of South America. If you recall, we had sort of a Spanish jurisdiction that was west of this line that the treaty proposed, and a Portuguese part, which was east of the line, including part of Brazil. And the other thing that is east of that line is the continent of Africa. So while the Portuguese route was working its way around Africa. And because of that, what we see is some early colonial activity in Africa is by the Portuguese. They are amongst the first of the colonial powers there. And in South America, we talked about the transatlantic slave trade, and a lot of that, the Portuguese by no means were the only ones involved, but they were heavily involved in the early transatlantic slave trade, and including a large amount of people brought to the Portuguese colony of Brazil. And the slave trade was part of something that's often called the triangular trade route. And if we look at ocean currents, because they go from Europe down into Africa, and then from Africa to the Americas, and then from the Americas, the Gulf Stream works its way back to Europe. And so this formed a triangle, which is a route where from Europe, finished goods were brought, guns, alcohol, other manufactured goods. Those were brought to Africa, and from Africa, these ships would leave with slaves headed to the Americas. And many of those slaves were brought to the Americas to work on plantations that we've discussed in South America and the Caribbean. And then the products from these plantations would then be brought back to Europe, thus completing that loop of trade. So just to give an overview, the colonial period, again, starts with Portugal. And by the way, they were amongst the first ones in, and also the last ones out. That the Portuguese retained their colonies much longer than many of the European power states. So it starts with the Portuguese. They were the early explorers along the coast in Africa. They gained control of trade, ports, and other European powers. I'd encourage you to watch the video on the Scramble for Africa, are seeing what's going on and starting to learn more about Africa, starting to explore it more, and starting to find that it is rich in natural resources. And this is a time when European powers are becoming more powerful because of the early industrial revolution and technology. And as such, they hatch plans to take over large parts of Africa. One of the culminating events of this is the Conference of Berlin in the late 1800s, where European powers got together at a conference with large maps of Africa and negotiated who would control what parts of Africa. So this involves people with these large maps who are not familiar with the cultures or languages of Africa, or the ways that the different ethnic groups are, superimposing these boundaries based on their own negotiations. And what we're going to look at in a moment is like, why is that problematic? Why are these artificial borders, without understanding of the underlying cultures, they can be problematic? And the thing you have to bear in mind is that the modern day boundaries we have around countries today are a direct product of this Berlin Conference, that when countries became independent, there wasn't really a mechanism for them to draw new borders. They had to sort of live within the borders that were drawn for them during this conference. So this is sort of a before and after image from the web. This is sort of the general situation before the Berlin Conference. You had some areas controlled by European powers, such as Algeria, controlled by France, Angola by the. So while there were some incursions by Europeans, it wasn't all, there were a lot of sort of vague areas where you had local control. However, by 1913, you had near total control of rare exceptions like Ethiopia. Ethiopia had been attempted to be colonized by Italy, but remained largely independent throughout the colonial period. There was a period of time it was occupied around the time of World War II, but it was fairly successful in resisting occupation during this whole period. So here's another view of the colonial situation in Africa. You have the French and British in West Africa, which is a large portion of the population live. You had the Belgian Congo. This is where King Leopold was operating. You had independent Ethiopia, and then various other German, Portuguese, French, and so on in other parts. Now, here's where the problem lies, that this figure is showing the red sort of circular areas are showing where you have different ethnic groups or different ethno-linguistic groups in Africa. And the black dashed lines are where these country boundaries are. And one thing you may notice is that they don't align well, that the country boundaries were superimposed without regard to the ethno-linguistic groups. And so you're doing two things. One, you're splitting up groups where part of a group may live in one country and part of the group lives in the other. And also you're combining groups that may not necessarily get political boundaries without good alignment to the cultural background is part of the reason for ethnic tension in various parts of Africa. No, part of the reason. A significant reason, really. Here's a figure from our book showing the situation through time. This is prior to the Berlin Conference or around that time. You have, incursions by various Europeans. You also have the independent kingdom of Ethiopia. That remains into the scramble of Africa, while pretty much the rest of Africa becomes colonized. Now, Liberia, this is Liberia here. It's kind of a special case. It was colonized, but it was a unique situation where you had freed slaves from the United States establishing sort of a return to homeland there. We'll talk about that later. Now, coming into the 1950s, the situation is starting to change, and I want to just jump ahead to 1958 here, where you start to have an independence movement in Africa, where one by one, African countries are gaining their independence, starting with Ghana, which used to be called the Gold Coast, is the modern-day country of Ghana. And then others like Sudan, and then into the 1970s, you had most of Africa gaining independence. Some of the last colonies were the Portuguese here. And then by 1994, you had near complete independence amongst African countries. Now, one other thing I want to bring up during the scramble for Africa is that while you had colonization by European powers, that colonization practices varied by European country. For example, the British ruled indirectly. So what they would do is find local rulers, pay them off or otherwise get them on their side, and they would rule, offer them power in their region, and they would rule indirectly through those local leaders. By contrast to the British, the Portuguese just ruled directly, and usually quite harshly. They brought their own people in and essentially really just took over the country. France had a different approach where they would try to groom leaders, bring them to France, educate them, and establish them as sort of local leaders. And then you had really the harsher extremes include what happened in Belgium. So I encourage you to see the video about King Leopold. So you really had a situation of exploitation and genocide under King Leopold. And there was similarly genocides that were perpetrated by some of the German colonies, that with some of the struggles with the indigenous people, some of them were kind of put out and kind of driven out to the desert and killed. And so while we think of the Holocaust or genocides happening in World War II, that some of what's happened in the German colonies prior to World War II were a precursor to that, but less well known because they happened outside of Europe.